Alan, by the way? Do we need a doctor here? What are we calling you here today?
Well, I guess it's just call me Alan, but
Oh,
yeah, official title is doctor, but it's the as I say to people, it's the fake type of doctor. It's the doctor of philosophy, not medical doctor.
nice, nice.
So,
You're too modest. Why don't you tell the listener a little bit about who you are and what you do, and then we're going to dive right into things.
yeah, so I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow in nutrition, chrononutrition, specifically this particular project. I did my PhD in nutrition, uh, still at the same institution, the University of Surrey in the UK. I did my MSc in nutrition science here as well, so I'm kind of part of the, furniture in the nutrition department in many respects. I came to science relatively later in life. I have a background in law. My undergraduate degree was in English literature and history, and then I went to law school, and then I practiced as a barrister, which is, I guess, the American equivalent of or the UK equivalent, Irish equivalent of a trial lawyer. And I did my master's during that process, interested primarily or motivated by my interest in kind of health regulation and policy. But then I got bitten by the research bug, so I transitioned full time into nutrition research, and the rest is kind of history.
I did not know that about you. I too
Oh,
didn't take the law degree all the way to its fullest endpoint, but also pivoted in the middle of that, we'll say, over to the nutrition side of things. That's interesting. How do you feel like that skill set has made you? Is it something you take with you, or that you still value
yes.
the things you've learned?
100%. A lot of the dots joined up in kind of hindsight, or certainly at least as I was going through my MSc, but I think they very much allowed a lot to click with me. So, law and science essentially evolve out of the same positivist epistemology. Um, in many respects, the presumption of innocence, so to speak, is akin in a legal sense to like a type one error. Like our in science, we're always evolving that something isn't true. The null hypothesis is there is no difference between group A and group B, so to speak, until that is rejected. So they're very much once the kind of epistemic similarities clicked with me and kind of concepts of evidence, I think it's actually gone a long way to informing how I think about science, how I think about evidence. And I've tried to bring a lot of that into the work I do, and even published a paper a couple of years ago that was very much kind of calling for a kind of a new paradigm of how we might think about evidence in nutrition research. And that's very much always informed by my legal background. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I could see the pursuit of truth through logic being a driver in both ways, in the formulation of the right questions to ask to get to the
Hmm.
truth in both fields. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Excellent. We are here today. You have a wonderful newsletter that you send out. I'm not sure if that's to only just paid subscribers that I am one of, or if
No,
this is
no,
something.
that's
Yeah.
yeah. The newsletter goes out to everyone, but
The,
there is a core of the paid subscribers always there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a ton of really great content that I was unaware of for a bit. I just have known you
Mhm.
as a person and a science communicator for a long time, but I didn't realize how much good information you're giving for paid people, but almost behind the scenes a little bit. But you sent out a newsletter that was titled "Does the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Add Up?" And
Mhm.
several weeks ago, I had Nick Norwitz on the podcast. My podcast is certainly not in the low carb camp at all. But I found
Mhm.
what they were doing interesting, and I didn't really want to get it from
Mhm.
anywhere but the horse's mouth. And so,
Yeah.
read what they had to say, read the editorial, read the all the studies they did. Yeah, and we can talk about that in a second. And I thought it was a fruitful conversation, and you and I will talk maybe to the dichotomy of what it's like to have a 2-hour conversation with somebody about this versus what these people are doing on social media. Because there is quite a bit of a dichotomy, as I'm learning, just in the
Yes.
way things are being communicated, and I think that's a thing that we should talk about. And anyway,
Mhm.
I had not seen a lot of, let's call it, people who have counter opinions taking the time to really put something together a little bit longer form instead of being like, somebody makes a 3-minute video about the Oreo versus statin study, and they're like, oh, this is just a garbage N of
Yeah.
one, and it's just like, don't, total dismissive. I was waiting for somebody else to put out something that was like, hey, I'm going to take the time to sit down, look at these arguments, talk about what parts maybe are interesting / true and what parts are not. And I thought your newsletter was really informative in that way. And I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit more about what you have to say once I do a hatchet job on steel manning the position of, let's call them, I don't know, whatever, pro lean mass hyperresponder, or just those who are researching this, talking about it, thinking that, have the opinion that this is something very interesting where these people might be at no risk or less risk. And so is there anything you think we should start off with before I do my best to set the scene?
No. I'm happy for you to set the scene, and we can take it from there.
Cool. I'm gonna do my best to get through this quickly. I want to be thorough, because I think anytime you are steel manning an opposing position, the whole point of steel manning is to do it well and to not straw man their argument. And so what we're going to talk about today is, again, if you have not listened to the episode with Nick, I think it's good to hear it from him. But we'll talk about what is the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, who cares. We'll do a super quick discussion of the lipid energy model, which is the hypothesis that they believe explains how this is happening. I suspect you're going to dive into that a little bit more detail, get a little bit more technical, which I welcome you to do. I'll brush over a little bit of the relevant research, things I think are relevant, and then I'll talk a little bit about the application discussion of risk. And I want to say for the listener, I am saying these things as I am, let's say, Nick or Dan Feldman or whoever, one of these guys. This is not 100% what I believe, nor is what I'm saying necessarily 100% true, but I'm going to set the scene. We're going to lay the land. And then you're going to kind of tell me where I'm wrong, tell me what I missed, and we'll have a good discussion. Again, the pursuit of truth through logical arguments here. Awesome. So what is the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype? A phenotype just means, let's say, a set of observable characteristics. Essentially, it's somebody with really high LDL over 200, high HDL over 80, and low triglycerides under 70, which for the listener is, let's say, an odd triad of markers, because the LDL is something you'd be like, wow, that's super duper high. That's not good. But the other two, you'd say, wow, those are actually pretty good. So it's a bit odd in that regard. That's what makes this, seemingly a unique set of characteristics. You have somebody with really high LDL that is seemingly not good at face value, but the other two look pretty good. And typically people with metabolic dysfunction, we're looking at almost all three of these in a dysregulated or less or not good scenario. You'd see typically somebody has high LDL, low HDL, high triglycerides. So this is not that scenario. These people are also typically lean and active and eating a low carbohydrate diet, but that's technically not a requirement for the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. Although at this point, I think that they're being a little bit pedantic about that. I think that that's a pretty closely tied association here. These people also tend to be lean and active alongside eating a low carb, high fat diet. So who cares? This combination of markers, again, notably the increase in LDL, is caused by, again, this is what they're saying, not necessarily the truth, a normal, not benign, physiological response to being lean, active, and eating a low-carb diet, which makes it less bad, this skyrocketed LDL. It makes that scenario less bad than other scenarios where high LDL may occur, maybe typical standard America diet, obesity, metabolic syndrome, typically in conjunction with other biomarkers that don't look good, we'll say. So they're saying the why behind this increased LDL is relevant to the risk profile, which I think, at face value is a fair scientific question or thought to have. AKA these people tend to be otherwise healthy, but they have this one biomarker that's through the roof, and they're being seen as high risk when maybe their risk is different than others or is unique in some way. Their hypothesis as to how this has happened, they've coined a term called the lipid energy model, or they've coined a model called the lipid energy model, which is a hypothesis that suggests, and again, I'm going to do a gross oversimplification. I know that you're going to go into it a little bit more technically, and I will be very happy for you to do so. This hypothesis suggests that when you eat fewer carbohydrates, you have less body fat. Your body uses more fat for energy. It increases hepatic secretion or liver secretion of triglycerides. They get sent out to other parts of the body to be used as energy. Those triglycerides are traveling through the body on what's called VLDLs. Those VLDLs, air quote, drop off that triglyceride where it needs to go, which results in low blood triglycerides. But that VLDL particle now becomes an LDL particle. And so through that process, we will now see an increase in LDL. There's something here about LDL sticking around a little bit longer that's a bit above me. But that process also, or because of that, the LDL will look higher. Somewhere in this process, cholesterol is shed, and I wouldn't even know if that's the right word. using some of their terminologies. And that's picked up by HDL. And that's also why the HDL is high. So we have high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides. And again, this process results in that triad of increased circulating LDL and HDL, but low triglycerides. Essentially, you're eating less carbs, your body produces and utilizes more fat for fuel, which leads to this outcome. And they would agree, you could reduce the LDL, right? You could almost reverse this process by the reintroduction of carbohydrates back into the diet. Some of the evidence or proof of concept, they did a web survey of 548 people, looking at 548 people eating a low-carb diet, and they found that BMI was inversely associated with LDL cholesterol change. Basically, the higher the BMI, the lower the BMI, the higher the LDL cholesterol went. Verbatim, low triglyceride to LDL cholesterol ratio, a marker of good metabolic health, predicted larger LDL cholesterol increases. In the case series, moderate reintroduction of carbohydrate produced a marker of decreased LDL cholesterol, which is what we just said, where you could reverse this process by reintroducing carbohydrates. Their conclusion, these data suggest that in contrast to the typical pattern of dyslipidemia, greater LDL cholesterol elevation on a carb-restricted diet tends to occur in the context of otherwise low cardiometabolic risk. In English, basically the healthier people were outside of this one marker, the higher the LDL went. So the healthier you were, the lower the BMI on average, in the context of otherwise low cardiometabolic risk, LDL went higher. Then they do this meta of RCTs in March. They looked at studies of people on a low carb diet. They showed that LDL change. They looked at studies that showed LDL and changes in BMI, and that showed an inverse correlation between BMI and LDL. Very similar kind of outcome. Lean people or people with a lean BMI, LDL went up a lot. If they were a moderate BMI, LDL didn't change very much. And if they were higher BMI, higher amount of body fat as a proxy, the LDL actually went down slightly. Again, their conclusion, a substantial increase in LDL is likely for individuals with low but not high BMI with the consumption of a low-carb diet. As carbohydrate restriction tends to improve other lipid factors, the clinical significance of isolated LDL cholesterol in this context warrants further investigation. I think there's something for debate there. And then Nick does this Oreo study, N of 1, where he basically eats his normal, let's say, ketogenic diet. He cranks his LDL up to like 500, and then he introduces Oreos into his diet and sees basically how much will that reduce his LDL by reintroducing carbohydrates. And then he did a washout period where he went back to his old diet again, brought his LDL back up to baseline, and then he compared the lipid lowering effects of Oreos to a low dose, or not a low dose, but just like a normal dose of a very popular statin. And long story short, the introduction of carbohydrates lowered, or in this case Oreos, lowered his cholesterol by a lot more than the statin. And so he's doing that. He's obviously making the point that I've done an unhealthy intervention of adding 12 Oreos per day into my diet, and it has caused what would seem to look like an improvement in health markers. How do we reconcile those two things? And so the last question before I shut up for hopefully the rest of this podcast is, what does that mean for risk? I think they would say, again, depending on through what medium they are asked, that we don't know. I'm going to say that we don't know. I think they would posit that. See, this is a challenge for me because what they say publicly, what is written in certain parts of their research are often quite different, and that's a grave frustration for me. I guess I will layer in on top of this what I think, because I can't get caught up in the social media just crazy emphasis and polarity and hyperbolism and all of this. Is that we don't know what this means for risk. Maybe it's less bad than people who have high LDL and low HDL and high triglycerides in the context of a standard American diet and obesity and other comorbidities. And, because the etiology or the reason why the LDL is going up matters for the risk profile of that person. I think that's a fair thing. I think they would cite maybe the differences in people who have genetic reasons for a high LDL versus people who have more of a lifestyle cause. Um, and they would say, hey, a low carb, high fat diet may really help some people improve their overall metabolic health. And it maybe is a huge net win for some people to go on a low carb diet, get healthier potentially, if that is, I would say potentially, if that is a means for somebody to do so. It's a big net win, even if now there remains a risk that they've now incurred, where their LDL, they're lean, they're otherwise healthy via other biomarkers and other markers of metabolic health, but they've skyrocketed their RDL. I think, and again, I will say, just to plug this, that speaking to Nick for an hour and a half, he said all of those things. We don't know. He says probably a good idea that you lower your ApoB. He says probably a good idea that you lower your LDL until we know more. That's not what's being communicated in social media spheres.
No.
But I would absolutely say that for the listener right now, that that it is certainly the case that as of right now, you would be healthier, all things being equal, lowering your, we'll say LDL/ApoB. But they're essentially saying these people might be at less risk than other people who have high LDL in the context of other biomarkers that don't look good. Did I miss anything? Where is this wrong? Is it wrong in the start in terms of mechanisms? Is this wrong? I will tell you right now, Alan, that I'm fascinated with the mechanisms, totally, but I'm way more fascinated with the outcome. I work with people.
Yeah.
I'm not a clinician, but I will have somebody who's like, hey, Jordan, here's my blood work. I have high LDL. Like, I will encounter this scenario in one way or another at some point, and I care way more about the outcome stuff. So while I think from a scientific responsibility, they have the responsibility to be thorough with their hypotheses and figure out kind of what's going on here. I am personally more concerned with the outcome stuff. Is this person actually at more risk? But I think it's important for us to be thorough from the get-go. So I'll stop now. I'd love to hear your takes. I know there's so much to break down there, but I'd love to see where you think it's important to start.
So I guess the first thing to start is, I guess, we might open a tab on something and then circle back around to it kind of at the end when we've gone through some of the mechanisms, which is, I think that the authors behind the model and this explanation of this observed phenotype take liberties with kind of a particular type of rhetoric that sounds kind of, it's couched in this scientific kind of epistemic humility. And I think as we pick at it, I don't believe there's substance to this. I think that there's a few priors that are not adequately addressed. For example, we have an overwhelming body of evidence from multiple converging lines of evidence, whether epidemiology, prospective cohort studies, randomized control trials, intervention trials directly targeting, LDL cholesterol lowering, genetic studies, which are so persuasive in the specific context of LDL cholesterol, because irrespective of the genetic variant someone might have that might relate to lower LDL cholesterol, when you stratify those genetic variants by a standardized unit of reduction, so say 10 milligrams per deciliter, because in the natural context, they would all influence LDL cholesterol to different magnitudes of lower LDL. When you standardize them per unit reduction, they result in the exact same, essentially, risk estimate, low reduction in risk, which really speaks to this pathway of LDL receptor mediated clearance of cholesterol from LDL as the kind of unifying pathway through which cardiovascular disease is lowered. Well, what I'm saying here is that all lines of evidence that we have converge to a relatively recent conclusion, summarized quite well by a paper in 2017 from Brian Ferens and colleagues. It was a big consortium paper from the European Atherosclerosis Society. That LDL cholesterol is an independent causal risk factor. Independent meaning it survives consideration and adjustment for these other factors that we look at. That's given us a particular hierarchy of risk factors, because risk factors are not all, we use the term risk factor ubiquitously, whether we're describing LDL cholesterol, HbA1c, whatever it is, fecal calprotectin, like these are all risk factors, but they're not necessarily all the same in their probity as far as what they are communicating. So we typically would stratify risk factors by whether, one, they are a risk factor that is in a causal pathway, i.e. the direct intervention to influence, reduce that risk factor leads to demonstrable reductions in disease outcomes that we're interested in. The second would be systems biomarkers or reporter biomarkers or risk factors. So these are biomarkers that are really important to consider in the clinical picture, like HDL and triglycerides. They're not independently causal, but they do serve very important functions in the overall assessment of an individual's risk. And then we have reporters of damage, biomarkers of damage, for example, coronary artery calcification. What we typically see with the authors behind this model is a kind of inversion sometimes of some of these risk factors. So CAC, for example, is given an enormous amount of weight when it's not telling us anything about the risk of the disease. It's a marker of damage already done, so to speak. It's not necessarily a kind of a prognostic in the sense that other risk factors would be. HDL and triglycerides, very important to consider to assess an individual's risk. And yes, atherogenic dyslipidemia is just very well established as a phenotype. And you described it. It's low HDL, high triglycerides, circulating triglycerides, and high LDL, but the composition of LDL is influenced by that burden of triglycerides. So we kind of tend to see smaller, dense LDL particles. So we see this in their published papers. If you go through them, you will eventually come across a statement that LDL and ApoB containing lipoproteins are in the causal pathway of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. In some of the other papers, it's kind of not necessarily as overtly stated, and it's kind of just left, hanging unsaid somewhere in the wings.
Could I pause you just for 1 second? Can I pause you just for 1 second
Yeah,
and read out a quote?
Absolutely.
Read out a quote in their editorial in Journal of Cardiology.
Yes.
Extreme hypercholesterolemia requires a prudent clinical approach. Given evidence that elevated levels of LDL-C and other ApoB-containing particles play a causal role in cardiovascular disease, there does not, at present, appear to be any sound argument for withholding consideration of LDL-lowering strategies in this situation. However, there are also clinical circumstances in which this principle may not be pragmatic or patient-centered. Now, that to me, that sentence is nowhere in the outward-facing content of these people.
No, nowhere.
Can you just reiterate what I just said in English for those who some of those words are?
I really struggled reading this sentence in this editorial because most people taking this and running off with it, or if you hack into some of the Facebook groups in this community, as we have done this, in order to get a sense of what conversations are going on in the kind of low carb keto carnivore community about LDL and about this phenotype, it's terrifying to see that the discordance. Like your average person following this or following, one of the authors in particular, Nick Norwitz, his social media, is not getting through to that paper and reading that sentence. They go on, if I'm correct in recalling, to state in that paper that we caution people against, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have it in front of me, but we caution people against accepting, narratives on social media, et cetera, et cetera. And so
I'll read the direct quote. It says, we warn individuals to be cautious of the risk of accepting information regarding LDL and ASCVD risk based on shared beliefs and opinions offered on social media.
Wow. Right. So there's various levels at which I struggle with this. The first is insofar, and I will go on to after this to describe how I think this relates to the model as they have proposed it specifically. And I do think it's important we steelman the mechanisms they've proposed. So they're acknowledging essentially ApoB is LDL is the causal pathway. We do see this emphasis on these other risk factors, which I think is useful. But if there is that acceptance, and as I will describe in a second, if there is that acceptance that LDL cholesterol as an ApoB expressing, ApoB containing lipoprotein, that the net result of this model is high levels of cholesterol rich LDL, high total ApoB, because they are inseparable with these individuals. It's impossible to have an LDL of 400 milligrams and not correspondingly have high ApoB, and they do exhibit high ApoB. And there is this acknowledgement in this editorial that this is the causal pathway. Then describing the model might be helpful, but then couching it in this language, as they often do, of we're agnostic with respect to risk. That's inconsistent. It's completely inconsistent with that statement that this is the causal pathway because the characteristic of LDL that establishes it is it's an independent risk factor in a causal pathway. So, yes, you might get glycemic control in particular is typically what is touted as a benefit of a ketogenic diet or weight loss in individuals. And I accept those things about a ketogenic diet. I think there are some caveats there as well, particularly being that the underlying metabolic physiology of risk related to glycemic control is not improved on a ketogenic diet. We know that now. You reintroduce carbohydrates, the same level of glucose intolerance is evident. It's simply that you withhold exogenous carbohydrate intake as a kind of means of getting glycemic control. But there's no underlying improvement in the physiology that might relate to metabolic disease. Like you're not improving beta cell function or these kind of characteristics of risk. So it's essentially kind of temporary improvement insofar as someone can sustain that diet. For me, in a pragmatic, and they go on to kind of pay lip service to this, well, it might not be pragmatic or individual. I don't necessarily know what that means. For me, the pragmatic, individualized approach, if someone was sitting in front of me saying, listen, I've gone on this diet. I was 120 kilos. I'm 95 now. My HbA1c is in range. My insulin, my glycemic control, this is all improved immeasurably, and my LDL has gone up. The pragmatic approach to me would be, okay, if you think this diet is doing all these great other things, and clearly there's been outcome-based results that we would not deny that individual, they've lost their weight, they've improved these other markers. To me, the pragmatic approach would be, let's actually think about maybe using a statin to lower your LDL cholesterol. Like that's to me the kind of pragmatic approach is if you're going to have diet-induced dyslipidemia as a result of this diet, well, there's modifications we can make there as well. We could try to get them to kind of have predominantly unsaturated fats and try to get in more fiber in the context of, higher fat foods like avocado and otherwise. But we'd also potentially pragmatically consider medication. And the problem with this community in particular is there is a clustering of very anti kind of authority, anti-government, anti-pharma, anti-science in many respects beliefs that cluster within the kind of low carb community as a whole. And I use that term as an umbrella term. And this is the problem because, and I'll just read out a few quotes I have from previously from an interpretation following the publication of one of the authors' papers in this regard. These are all tweets that people showed. Um, so one of them was, now you will soon be able to go see your family doctor and explain to him that cholesterol is protective and that the pro-metabolic diet is not the one we have been told to eat since we were born. Another one says, Pfizer will not be happy about this, neither will the cholesterol trialist collaboration from Oxford, laughing face emoji. This is how this stuff is being interpreted in the context of a definitively anti pharmacological lowering of LDL kind of framework and corner of this community, which worries me. So they can hide behind, well, we've said this in this editorial. I'm like, these people aren't reading those editorials. This community as a whole isn't reading this evidence. So I think that's probably a good point of departure then to kind of go into the mechanisms of the model as it relates to why do we see this massive increase in LDL that's diet induced, but also goes in many cases further in its increase than we might expect from kind of the evidence that we have for diet induced effects on dyslipidemia. And the description of the model, the lipid energy model, as they've called it, was proposed in a paper published in 2022 in the journal Metabolites. And it was a narrative review, basically just kind of proposing a mechanistic explanation for the lean mass hyperresponder. And there were essentially kind of two key characteristics, and you've described the model already, so I'll give it a kind of recap. So you're on a very carbohydrate restricted diet, and you are, as a result, the primary substrate for fuel utilization is both endogenous stored fatty acids, stored triglyceride and fat, and of course the fat that comes into the diet. Their mechanism essentially ignores the exogenous pathway of dietary fat. It does not speak to dietary fat intake at all as an exogenous pathway. It's very much focused on endogenous fatty acid metabolism. So you've got triglycerides stored in your fat cells. You've got a release of that for energy. You've got circulating free fatty acids that are quite high because that's your primary substrate. Those fatty acids are trafficked to the liver. They're packaged into triglycerides and they are exported from the liver in VLDL. The first important mechanism that they describe is a characteristic, as they believe it, that this phenotype exhibits is very high activity of lipoprotein lipase. This is an enzyme that breaks down the triglyceride that would be in VLDL. So they have very high LPL mediated triglyceride breakdown in these VLDL. That results in the rapid depletion of the triglyceride from that VLDL, but a retention of its cholesterol. So that transcends from a triglyceride-rich VLDL quite quickly because very high LPL activity breaks down those triglycerides, eventually into a cholesterol ester-rich LDL particle. Now, there's another characteristic of lipid metabolism. This is, again, they're not new in introducing this, but they're suggesting it's part of the model, which is equimolar lipid exchange, which is where lipoproteins in the circulation can essentially have a kind of a weight matched exchange of lipids that relates to the kind of function of the lipoprotein and the density of the lipoprotein. And what that means is that, so you mentioned the surface components. So you might have additional phospholipids, for example, free cholesterol, and that can be exchanged between HDL and LDL and other lipoproteins in the forward cholesterol transport pathway, VLDL in particular. And HDL can accept those and ensure that there is a kind of a continual recycling of the cholesterol in the circulation. And so you see HDL increase as a kind of concomitant response to the fact that there is now an increased circulating level of cholesterol. There's an increased circulating lipoproteins, and HDL is increasing to try to kind of compensate for that effect. That means that because that cholesterol is being exchanged, in particular, because you have a very low kind of circulating triglyceride level, you don't have triglyceride, for example, in the other side of this phenotype, so to speak. They mentioned atherogenic dyslipidemia a lot. What happens there is that VLDL becomes so burdened with triglyceride, it basically dumps that onto HDL. HDL is catabolized in the liver. You get low HDL. You get this remodeling of LDL under the burden of triglyceride kind of spillover. In this, the opposite occurs. We've got really rapid and efficient breakdown of that triglyceride and an increase in the cholesterol ester content of LDL, HDL increasing, and in turn, essentially, we have low activity of what's known as cholesterol ester transfer protein. And that means that we have this kind of higher HDL and higher LDL level in the context of this very low triglycerides. Now to circle back, we mentioned the editorial where they say ApoB and LDL are in the causal pathway of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So I think it's important to take these two primary mechanisms just to, because I know there was a lot there for listeners. So let's distill it into two components. The first is very high triglyceride turnover mediated by LPL. The second is low CETP activity, meaning that we have high HDL, and that HDL is, exchanging and taking on some of the lipid in the circulation. Now we can actually kind of stress test how these mechanisms might relate to risk through wider evidence. So to start with the LPL factor, one is, and I think a really instructive paper in this regard, published by Brian Ferentz, who has just done incredible work with genetic research in relation to lipids and risk. This is a paper published in JAMA in 2019, which compared LDL cholesterol lowering genetic variants with LPL variants, so triglyceride lowering LPL genetic variants. So if you've got a genetic variant that leads to higher LPL activity and more rapid triglyceride turnover. And what was fascinating was that they took the effects of these variants, and again, standardize them per a particular reduction of ApoB, per 10 milligrams per deciliter lower ApoB. And once standardized to that, uh, they essentially, the LPL lowering variants and the LP and the LDL lowering variants and the triglyceride lowering LPL variants essentially exhibit the same magnitude of lower cardiovascular risk, i.e., the effect of the LPL variants in lowering cardiovascular risk still related to a net reduction in the overall atherogenic burden, not an increase in it, as this model is essentially proposing. And so I think that's the first thing. Where this mechanism of very high LPL mediated triglyceride breakdown and turnover, resulting in low triglycerides, to be expected to, if there's a way that we could say, how might this mechanism relate to risk? We would expect it to relate to risk through a lowering of the atherogenic burden. This model is describing an increase in the atherogenic burden. And then the second thing is CETP inhibitors. Well, this is actually a lot like, I guess we've got a kind of more established, so to speak, body of evidence to draw from interventions, because when the HDL era started to emerge 20 years ago, and people thought maybe it's not LDL, maybe we want to deliberately increase HDL based on this replicable observation in epidemiology that higher HDL is very protective of cardiovascular disease. And so CETP inhibitors were developed to inhibit CETP and increase HDL. And most of those trials largely failed. There's been some more recent trials that have kind of looked at kind of second generation CETP inhibitors like anacetrapib, and some of them have found modest reductions in cardiovascular risk, cardiovascular disease outcome risk, that relate to the magnitude to which ApoB and LDL cholesterol are lowered. So where the kind of first generation of CETP inhibitor trials was essentially were kind of going wrong was the underpinning hypothesis that the deliberate increase of HDL was itself sufficient to lower cardiovascular outcomes. That's largely been as a result of these trials disproven. This is why there's less focus on HDL now. This is why HDL isn't considered a biomarker in the causal pathway. It's considered a kind of a systems biomarker. So the kind of more recent CETP inhibitor trials that have found a reduction of risk have done so, have found that reduction through lowering of
LDL.
ApoB and LDL cholesterol. Yes, exactly. And that's confirmed by some genetic analyses as well of genetic variants in CETP activity. So in these two core mechanisms of kind of the endogenous pathway of lipid metabolism that results in cholesterol ester rich LDL particles, the mechanisms that they describe, as I see it, where they to relate to risk would be expected to relate to risk through, again, a lowering of LDL cholesterol and a lowering of the atherogenic burden. And so mechanistically, it doesn't seem to add up to me. And I don't think this is why I have a difficulty with it. And I think it's very kind of false, so to speak, epistemic humility. We don't know. We just don't know. This is such a unique phenotype. And it's like, yes and no. Yeah, sure, it is a unique phenotype, but it's not a unique observation. And we have to come back to the nature of the risk factor. And it's a cumulative exposure over time, which is why just doing a cross-sectional study or just taking a certain, none of the evidence to date is of any sufficient probative value to allow us to have that kind of agnostic, we just don't know, wait and see approach, as I see it. And I think that the disconnect between some of the more tempered language and some of their editorials and what we see on social media is a major problem. But as I see it, even within the mechanisms that their model has described, it doesn't, to me, add up to something that would allow you any luxury with how we might consider the relationship between having very high cholesterol rich LDL and risk. And then just to kind of round this out is, like I said, it basically ignores the exogenous pathway. And I think this is highly relevant. The characteristics they're describing are people on ketogenic, high fat, very carbohydrate restricted diets. To only focus on endogenous hepatic mediated cholesterol and lipid metabolism, I think is really, it's been difficult methodologically until recent years to study the exogenous pathway with a little more granularity because chylomicron turnover tended to be quite quick. It is quite quick. Um, but we now have some more elegant methods, stable isotope tracers in particular. And there's been some recent work, for example, like we used to always think that, well, everything that's intestinally secreted, like dietary fat comes in, triglyceride goes through, and it emerges into the circulation in the form of chylomicrons. And we actually now know there's direct VLDL sized secretion from intestinally derived lipids, from intestinally derived triglycerides. There's been some really elegant research recently, and we can distinguish between ApoB containing lipoproteins of intestinal origin, so dietary fat, by the number that they express essentially. So ApoB 48, we can identify lipids of intestinal origin, and ApoB 100 are lipids of hepatic origin, endogenous origin, which is the model that they're describing. As it relates to the exogenous kind of dietary fat pathway, some of the evidence recently, for the first time, very much showed that ApoB48 residence time, so again, intestinally derived lipid residence time, can be quite extended, even over the course of an entire day. Indeed, now this wouldn't apply to lean mass hyperresponders, but what they did find was a relationship with circulating triglyceride levels. So individuals with higher triglyceride had a much greater residence time. Okay, we might expect that. They have impaired lipid metabolism. The hypothesis I think the lean mass hyperresponder authors would put forward is, well, we've got very efficient lipid metabolism. We're otherwise metabolically, we're not overweight or anything. Yes, I think that the elevations that we're seeing in LDL cholesterol would not sufficiently just be explained by the endogenous pathway. And I think that their lack of consideration of the exogenous pathway is missing a huge piece of the puzzle. And I wouldn't be surprised, were some tracer studies to be done here, if you actually saw a combination of really suppressed LDL receptor mediated clearance, which we would expect, a very concrete finding in relation to the effects of saturated fatty acids. Most of these people, for the most part, are consuming relatively high saturated fat content. So there's one kind of potential mechanism there that would explain a degree of the diet-induced dyslipidemia. But the sheer kind of quantity of fat in the diet might also be something that exogenously is explaining this overall impact. Again, I'm not convinced that there's a luxury of necessarily being agnostic with respect to risk, nor do I think that the mechanisms as they have currently outlined are sufficient to offer any sort of robust suggestion that risk is somewhat obviated or kind of attenuated given the levels of LDL cholesterol that are exhibited in this phenotype.
Wonderful and incredibly thorough. And I think I can hear it in your voice where as much as we are looking at these mechanisms and there's parts of it that, again, it's when you hypothesize, sometimes and you get into battles with people like this over the internet. It happens every day with like seed oils and stuff where like there's an argument posited that sounds like we don't have information on this topic. So, hey, we're just going to do our best with kind of making a rational argument. And what you're saying is, well, that's a smidge disingenuous because we have research to at least indirectly look at the mechanisms by which you think this is happening. And it's not. So you're not arguing that this phenotype doesn't become a thing, that somebody couldn't develop this phenotype. It's like you're like, cool, like this happens, right? This happens to some people when they get lean, low carbohydrate diet. It's more of by the nature of the mechanisms by which it's happening. Where in there would we suspect that this happening for this reason makes this person at less risk? And it just doesn't, it seems like the way that might happen would be by lowering LDL and ApoB, not by increasing it, which is what happens. There's a lot here, and I want to go through some of my biggest fears and problems, and I want to see if you're on a similar page. I think, would the authors be sitting with us today, as I've asked them directly, if you take a lean mass hyperresponder and you give them sweet potato every day and their ApoB comes down, is that person now at less risk of all-cause mortality? The answer is yes. They would say yes, I think. They would quickly after saying yes, say, but that dietary change, that habitual change, has downsides, and so nothing is only upside here. They might reduce their ApoB, but they might incur other quality of life decline. Maybe this is a person who adopts a ketogenic diet for a clinical use. Maybe it improves their IBS or IBD, or it reduces seizures. Fine. I think that there's room for that. Go ahead.
Then treat the risk factor. I've never had a difficulty with the clinical application of a carbohydrate restricted or low carbohydrate diets. I've spoken to friends of mine that are in diabetes research and clinical diabetes type 2 management as well. They're clinician researchers. And their whole approach is always, let's be pragmatic about it. If someone can do this diet and their HbA1c normalizes and they come off diabetes medications, but their LDL goes up, let's just treat the medication, like pharmacologically lower their LDL. And then essentially they get the best of both worlds. But again, the problem is this community, the information ecosystem of this community is really poisonous. And I worry, and I don't even worry, I will fully argue that the authors behind this model, I think, hide from the implications of the manner in which they disseminate their ideas. And and that's probably because they'll get rounded on. They are firmly entrenched in this community, and were they to actually be a little bolder in saying what I've just said, I think they'd get destroyed. To use the term, they'd get cancelled, so to speak. And so, the other thing that I think is really important to consider is, again, this portrayal of this is so novel. This actually, insofar as the lean component of this, I think first off, there's a bit of a problem with that in terms of thus far, the model is just defined by BMI. BMI is useful, but it's not necessarily telling us, like, that this should be more appropriately termed a kind of low BMI hyperresponder rather than a lean mass. Like, we don't know the lean mass of the individuals on this diet. And the reason I say that is because it's very well established. You mentioned their meta-analysis published in March, which was basically a meta-analysis of the impacts of low carbohydrate diets relative to kind of BMI. That's not a novel finding. There's a previous meta-analysis by Ju and colleagues, which found about a millimole per liter increase in LDL cholesterol in individuals in the normal BMI range. There was another meta-analysis also published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition this year in July from Wang and colleagues. That found pretty much the same as a 1.08 millimole per liter increase. So about 38 milligrams per deciliter, I think you use in the US, increase in LDL cholesterol. So what they're offering isn't novel. It's in fact a replicable finding in the literature that there is this relationship between BMI and the impact of diet on blood lipids. One of the proposed mechanistic explanations for this is a relationship between adiposity and LDL receptor sensitivity and activity, where increasing adiposity does appear to kind of dampen or downregulate LDL receptor responsive to dietary change, particularly dietary fat composition. Here's another interesting observation. This goes back to the 1960s, but in anorexia nervosa, we see quite profound elevations in blood lipids. Yep. That is obviously unexplained by diet. And it appears to inversely relate to their body weight. And we have several studies that have shown that the more that, like, energy is restricted in a weight, like when there is severe, people get a BMI down to 15 or under, and you see a kind of reciprocal relationship with blood lipids and LDL cholesterol. So there's something even beyond this phenotype. There's tying this all together, including this phenotype. We can kind of start to make a wider supposition that there's some degree of relationship between either energy intake, body mass, and responsiveness to, either in the case of anorexia, one of the proposed mechanisms is like the body's desperate attempt to create energy dumps, whatever available kind of, fatty acids into circulation. Uh, it's not entirely dissimilar to this. All I'm doing is saying that there is wider evidence of a degree of a reciprocal relationship between lower BMI and higher blood lipids. Am I comparing anorexia to the lean mass hyperresponder? No, of course not. But what I'm saying is this is again an observable phenomenon of a relationship. And I guess what annoys me about the rhetoric publicly that the authors behind this model are really kind of doing science and being seen to, being kind of rigorous is, to me, there are very simple first steps and low-hanging fruit that you could take to more properly investigate this. And I don't think they're being taken. Um, I think the N of one experiments are a bit of a joke, if I'm honest. I think the cross-sectional study they've done, there's far too much noise about relative to the kind of methodological rigor and the value of the findings from any cross-sectional study. I mean, it's just hypothesis generating, which they've already generated the hypothesis. Um, so there are some probably kind of lower hanging fruit options that they could take to try and more thoroughly actually quantify this phenotype. Uh, what is the relationship genuinely between lean mass and body fat, quantified body composition, and blood lipids in this context? They haven't done that. So yeah, overall, I think it's interesting. I think it deserves to be steel manned, but ultimately, there isn't any evidence that we have that would falsify what I'm about to say, which is that there's no evidence that there's any unique metabolic or dietary state in which diet-induced dyslipidemia is not related to cardiovascular outcomes at higher levels of blood lipids and LDL cholesterol in particular. So, I mean, until we have some kind of longer term prospective data in this phenotype, and again, that's a low hanging fruit study they should be doing, and I don't think they are particularly interested in taking their ecological sample of 548 people from the Facebook group they did the BMI study with and following them over 10 years. That's what they should be doing scientifically. If this rhetoric of we're really interested, we're curiously, agnostically, humbly looking at risk, well, then do it properly. And yeah, so I'm very uneasy with the public facing rhetoric. And the authors behind this model leverage the worst of their community to further their ideas. And I think that says a lot. Um, yeah.
I have a post that basically I did a post about steak and butter gals LDL levels like 350 or something, and it's almost, I mean, my account's not very big, it's almost at 1 million views, and there are 30,000 comments on it, and I'm fighting with people about lean mass hyperresponder. Oh, she's lean mass hyperresponder. And they're like, you should talk to Nick Norwitz. I'm like, you don't understand what he would say. Like
Yes,
you
yes.
are giving me, you're telling me to go see his Twitter or something. I'm telling you I had
Yeah.
a 2-hour podcast with him and I've read the editorial, and because you've consumed outward facing content from a Twitter
Right.
and Facebook groups, you're using that to come and argue with me, but you don't. And it's his fault, right? It's
Yes.
the author's fault, of course, that there's this dichotomy between what is outward facing and what they might in their own homes in the silence believe. And I just find
Mhm.
that hysterical. I mean, every comment will end up in them literally telling me to go check out these guys, and I'm like, you don't
But
understand what they believe, right? Like, or
yes,
what
and
they
and and
said in the research, let's say.
but I didn't follow him. I don't follow him. My approach is if they're doing this science thing, then that is the level I will treat them at. I will read their published papers, but I'm not interested in following along on social media. But for recent purposes, when myself and Danny Lennon and Dr. Gary McGowan did a podcast for Sigma Nutrition on this, I did decide to kind of tune in for a little bit just to see. And I found that Nick Norwitz in particular behaved the same way. So where someone would make a comment, it would be like, go and read these papers, or, go and listen to this. And and I get it to an extent. If you have published work, you can direct people to it. But I also found it as kind of a way of saying, so we did that. I've listened to the 5 hour marathon he
with
did
Simon.
with Simon. I listened to your interview with him. I've read all of their published papers. I take their ideas seriously. And yet when it comes to, a hard critique, which I think we did give in that episode, and they were alerted to it, suddenly they're trying to take this kind of fake high road. Like, oh, we know that they didn't seriously engage with our ideas. It's just it's bullshit.
I came to learning about this through their more published work, and not necessarily on purpose. Just hadn't. It's not like I'm entrenched in the low carb community. So came across maybe it was Simon's podcast or something, and I was like, cool. Let me go look at the actual research. I didn't even follow Nick at the time, and so if you heard me in that podcast, I was quite complimentary to Nick. And I'm not. I don't want to just this isn't like some sort of backstabbing podcast, but it's because in the 96 hours prior to that, I read everything 5-10 times from the literature perspective, and like you said, very conservative, very scientifically genuine, seeking truths and exercising caution. And so I was quite complimentary in that podcast. And again, not to play some like backyard recess middle school thing, but if you follow Nick and you follow his Twitter and you're in these Facebook groups and that's not what's happening. And that's a frustration. No. And I want to be respectful of your time. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that's really important though, because at the one hand, they're trying to. Oh, I made this point in the Sigma episode because I've been around this space for a while now, and I've seen the way the low carb community in particular operates, and they love to kind of enact a self-fulfilling prophecy that no one takes our ideas seriously, and then that's framed as a kind of, oh, they don't want to know, or that they think what the establishment wants to think and whatever.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that these words have come out of
Sure.
Nick's mind, but they do perpetuate. Certainly Dave Feldman, one of the other authors, really perpetuates this kind of, oh, no one wants to seriously engage with our ideas. And it's like, but if you were someone that's incredibly credible and you tune in for 2 seconds, why would you? And there is this real disconnect there with how they portray that. And I also think that there's a disconnect with aspects of the model, like you mentioned the Oreo study, for example, right? Well, Nick's prediction, right, was that his, like gaining weight and overfeeding would lower his LDL, right? And then what happened was, sorry, this isn't the Oreo one. It was the overfeeding experiment, right? So this is another one of his N of ones. And he said, I'll overfeed on a ketogenic diet by approximately 6,000 calories a day, and my LDL cholesterol will drop. And it actually increased from like 490 to like 540 milligrams. And he just changed the goalposts.
I'm still lean.
So he predicted it would.
Yeah,
he would predicted it would reduce LDL, and then he was like, well, I've increased BMR and whatever. So it's like, oh, so if LDL goes down, that it's consistent with the lipid energy model. But if it goes up, this is also consistent with the lipid energy model. Yeah. And so, they've got this model, and they'll attempt to keep kind of fitting things into it. And then the communication, the N of ones, I think, allow him to leverage social media to create an idea or a conversation about the model and this phenotype that is actually divorced from the probity and value of the evidence, the actual scientific contributions that they've produced to date. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's very much maybe consistent with this era that we're in, this overlap between social media and science. But I think that's very much a tactic. I think it's a feature rather than a bug. And this idea that he will kind of portray, and I've seen this in his interactions, is that I'm not, I have my ideas and I'm all humble and curious and nuanced, hashtag, I can't be responsible for these other things. And it's like, no, you can't be responsible for policing your community and everyone's posts, but you can be responsible for the manner in which you direct your rhetoric. And I think that humility language soup that he applies is really just kind of music to the community's ears rather than a serious articulation, because I think that the manner in which ideas are leveraged on social media is entirely inconsistent with someone who's genuinely true to their ideas or their commitment to kind of epistemic, humility and kind of intellectual honesty. And I really don't see it with the authors behind this model.
If you want to argue that doing something for shock value can be a net positive, right? If you want to say, oh, Nick, would say like, hey, I did the Oreo study because look what happened. Everyone's talking about the Oreo study. We have more eyes on it, and I'm doing that because it'll generate money for more good research that will help us genuinely get to the answers. And so if you want to make an argument that philosophically speaking, doing something for shock value can have a net benefit because it can generate greater eyes on things and greater attention, no problem. Do it like Jordan Syatt eating a Big Mac every day to lose weight, to talk about energy balance, right? Do it in a way like I get it. Jordan's a close friend, and I forgot back in maybe, I don't know, 2020, ate a Big Mac every day for a month, lost 7 pounds. He used it to talk about energy balance and talk about, you can include your favorite foods and all of that. But so I get it. You can do something for shock value because you know that will bring eyes to it, and it will bring eyes to just something that you feel is important and deserves awareness. No problem. I think that you and I are just agreeing that it's not being done in the most genuine manner, let's say.
Well, if like these are people in academia for the most part, apart from Dave Feldman
Fair.
and a few others,
It's
there
different.
is a way that this works, which is you sit down, you write a compelling grant application, and you go to a funder to get that money. And I find it and they're not doing that as far as I can tell, right? The cross-sectional study was through the citizen science, I don't know, whatever. Um, the idea that again, the ketogenic diet, like people won't fund this. That's again, let's just look at Kevin Hall's research. Highly funded, tightly controlled metabolic studies where he's looked at ketogenic diets. They're not doing the bread and butter basics. And Nick is essentially an early career researcher. I think he did his PhD. So and I appreciate he's a med student, right? Like he's not. I don't know how it works over there, but it seems to me that he's studying medicine. He's not in a kind of research program, so funding is probably not something that is particularly available to him. So it would be, time consuming. But he's got people like David Ludwig on this. You telling me that someone with that kind of established reputation that you can't sit down and write a grant application and go to the NIH or go to another funding body and say, hey, we do have gaps in our knowledge about lipid metabolism in certain contexts, and give us at least money for a pilot study that we might do with a bit more rigor and a bit more of a sample size than this N of one bullshit. They're not doing that as far as I can tell. And to me, again, that is very telling. Like this pretense of we're doing science, I don't buy it. I think what they're trying to do is so enough doubt that allows them to kind of essentially be kind of heroes in their own community. But I don't know that they're particularly interested in doing the kind of and maybe just to posit this, maybe that's because at some level they wouldn't be particularly, fond of some of the outcomes. I mean, in my opinion, even the argument that ketogenic diets confer, this profound kind of benefit, I don't particularly see that in the published research. And the problem with the ketogenic diet is I'm sure you're familiar with the no true Scotsman fallacy. Like this is the problem with the ketogenic diet and the community going back years. Every study that comes out that is, like a randomized trial or, at least some sort of like metabolic study, even the response to Kevin Hall's research, there's never for the low carb ketogenic community, there's never the perfect study that has truly tested the ketogenic
Yeah.
diet. And so whatever evidence comes out that's underwhelming, most of the evidence is underwhelming. The metabolic benefits are certainly underwhelming. Like we pretty much see impaired glucose tolerance once carbohydrates are reintroduced or once a mixed meal is reintroduced. That's been demonstrated repeatedly under controlled settings. So, and yet they march on, assuming that this is a kind of panacea that has yet to be strenuously tested by science. And this is a diet that goes back to the 1920s, you know. And so I very much always see the no true Scotsman fallacy in the way that they think and talk about this diet. Like, no study is ever perfect enough to have truly tested a ketogenic diet. And they talk about these opaque, kind of amorphous concepts like fat adaptation. Oh, the participants weren't fat adapted. Oh, what does that mean? No one's ever offered an actual definition for when someone is fat adapted. We typically go by circulating ketones. Certainly plenty of evidence that people are in a state of nutritional metabolic ketosis. Um, so I think we're dealing with true believers, uppercase TB, who have a preconceived conclusion, hide that behind this false piety and language of kind of epistemic humility, and essentially are trying to work backwards, think is already true, and will do designs, N of ones, cross-sectional studies, anything that doesn't really rigorously test their hypothesis that allows them to then say, wow, see, maybe. And that's not doing science as far as I'm concerned.
Agreed. Agreed. I'm gonna, for the listener, see if we can. I'm gonna go through some of the maybe take homes, and I want you to add, subtract, chew up, spit back out any of these as they come out. I'd say, and we've obviously gone through one of the huge problems being just the communication of risk, the difference between outward-facing content and conservative positions hidden inside content people will never see. This appeal to a slightly radical low carb group that is more likely to make you famous if you make them happy. Less likely to make you famous if you're more conservative. I mean, if I post that quote in a Facebook group and I say, "What do you guys think about this opinion?" they would rip it to shreds. I'd be like, "This is your deity. Yeah. This is your God speaking here." I have that all the time where I'm like, "You guys know that he would say that ApoB is an independent risk factor, right? You guys know that that's like written in the content, right? Like you guys get that?
Yeah.
So that is a huge, huge, massive problem. I think we've gone through some of the other problems of the way that these people are going about it. Speaking more to the phenotype, the state of dyslipidemia, the cause of it, the risk profile, I think here are some of my biggest fears and problems that I think people will think LDL doesn't matter. People will just think, okay, it doesn't matter, or it's good. They will move from lowering ApoB is probably a good idea to it's benign to more is better. They'll move along the spectrum in that regard, and that is one of my biggest fears. I think people that would otherwise, so let's say you're a lean mass hyperresponder, and you would be otherwise fine. You hear me say, hey, if you add back sweet potato, your ApoB goes down, you'll be healthier that way. There will be people who will never get that piece of information. They'd be, Nick would say, oh, I can't do that. I got to give IBD flare-ups when I add back carbs, which by the way, for him could be totally true. People have epilepsy. It might be a good idea to stay in ketosis. Like, no problem. But there's probably a humongous percentage of people that are in a category of, my life would be otherwise fine if I added a little bit of sweet potato back, if I knew that doing so would dramatically reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease from elevated ApoB. There's a huge percentage of people who are probably in that camp, and who won't do that because that information will never get to them. And like you said, even if you can't do that, there will be people who will forego pharmacological intervention because they don't think that it matters. And they've been, entrenched in a anti-establishment camp that would look down upon pharmacological intervention in general. People in general are being held back from being their healthiest, even if going from where they were to becoming lean mass hyperresponder has made them healthier in the process. They're being withheld from being their healthiest. I see people all the time. They're like, I went low carb and my triglycerides went down and I lost weight and my, like you said, A1C got into a normal range. It's like, yeah, that's great. You became healthier. I love that. I mean, you could be sitting here making an argument that a carnivore diet is healthier than the standard American diet if it caused you to lose. I mean, you could make that argument, but you are being withheld from being your healthiest. Just because something made you healthier does not mean that is the healthiest thing. I think people are being withheld from being able to be their healthiest. And any fears you'd add to that?
No, that is essentially my fear. Like, I understand why people find their way to a given diet. There is not a single diet that is a panacea. There are varying reasons why people arrive at a point where they believe that a diet is some kind of, primary kind of point of that. And it does have a big big impact on health, obviously, but there is this culture within particularly this diet group or kind of area which very much sees it as a kind of panacea, and therefore, and that's where the cognitive dissonance comes in, right? Because if this is supposed to be the diet, if this is supposed to be the diet of that has allowed someone all this health gain as they see it, how could anything be wrong with it? How could there be any kind of negative? There can't be. And so we get into this cognitive dissonance where they're being told, hey, your LDL is elevated. You should probably think about this to like, they can't reconcile those two things. So I think that's why we see that. And so and also I think to come back to this point of like, is this a real improvement? Like the people are like, well, I would be concerned about reintroducing carbohydrates. Like I don't think anyone's asking them to go back eating jellies. It's generally carbohydrate type and quality does matter. And the idea that the inclusion of carbohydrates in a diet is a barrier to an individual achieving improved metabolic health. I mean, that's demonstrably falsifiable. Like it's not. Generally, what is needed to achieve this improvement in metabolic health is simply a magnitude of weight loss, cumulative weight loss, and fat loss, and particularly abdominal fat loss. That's what's required. Any diet can get an individual that ultimate outcome. And for some people, that is a ketogenic diet. But to really circle back to this, if someone wants to adopt this diet and try it, do not get sucked into the community, so to speak, because it's a poisoned information ecosystem. And in order to be able to retain the ability to kind of think through your overall risk profile, I think someone needs to really stay divorced from a lot of the kind of rhetoric we see in that community. And it may be that you get all these other risk factor improvements, but isolated, elevated cholesterol rich LDL is sufficient over time to bring about a cardiovascular outcome. So this idea of, but I'm otherwise metabolically healthy. Well, you're not cardiovascularly healthy. So trading other risk factors for a causal risk factor doesn't exactly sound like the kind of health gain that I think people think it is.
What I'll leave you with this last question, and then I'll wrap it up. But what sort of, like you mentioned, hey, if they were really truly looking out for people's best interest, and I put those words in your mouth, they might run studies like X, Y, and Z. Is there something that let's say you took over trying to answer this question as your sole body of work in life? What sorts of studies would you run next? What's something you'd like to see maybe next?
Yeah. I mean, I'm even thinking about this for next steps because I think it's interesting. The first thing is, given that they do have this kind of ecological population that they're clearly in touch with via whatever Facebook groups and otherwise, I think given the nature of LDL as a risk factor, as an exposure, is that it's a cumulative exposure over time. So it's net effects that add up over time. It's the combination of how high your LDL is and how long you've been exposed to that level of LDL cholesterol. So take someone with familial hypercholesterolemia, homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, the worst scenario you could find yourself in genetically. If left undiagnosed and untreated, someone with homozygous FH can have a cardiovascular event, indeed cardiovascular mortality, by their early 30s. But that sounds quite profound relative to our life expectancy. But think about it. They've been exposed to levels of LDL that are 500-600 milligrams since they were basically 11 or 12. And that's roughly, that you can picture the time course before they have a cardiovascular event. The point is, this doesn't occur over 1 year. It doesn't occur over 5 years. So I think the most honest test of the nature of LDL as a risk factor in this population would be to establish an ongoing prospective cohort, observationally keeping people in that cohort, having some repeated measures or collections of their blood lipids over time, and looking compared to another population or comparative group of lower LDL cholesterol, in 10 years' time. So I think that would be the first thing, setting up a prospective cohort. It would be small, but it needs to be done to actually truly consider the nature of the exposure of LDL. The second thing would be more kind of controlled, short-term metabolic studies that would utilize stable isotope tracers to more kind of thoroughly investigate the metabolic fate of exogenous dietary fat intake in this phenotype in kind of low BMI individuals on a kind of ketogenic, low carbohydrate diet. Also looking, considering the actual mechanisms that they've proposed themselves, and very much getting a bit more granular with this definition of what constitutes lean and the relationship between BMI and blood lipids. And then so that would be kind of mechanistic work within which one of the interesting things we have, again, wider evidence of this going back, and this is real kind of nitty gritty old school nutrition metabolism stuff. But the relationship between carbohydrates, why do carbohydrate reintroductions see this decrease in LDL, might have to do with, we can maybe discuss this another day, but this concept of a delipidation pathway, it relates to kind of VLDL metabolism. So it's the potential role and relationship between carbohydrate in the process of exogenous or influencing exogenous and endogenous lipid metabolism, VLDL in particular. That would be something I would look at, again, utilizing stable isotope tracers, but in the context of stepwise differences in carbohydrate intake in this phenotype. So that would be a controlled kind of inpatient well, they're not patients, in residential kind of study. That's the kind of work I'd be looking to do. So, that would require funding, but that's what you do in science. Yeah. You get your heads together, precisely characterize the relationship between exogenous dietary fat and what happens to that in the context of this phenotype and its relationship with endogenous fat, kind of lipid metabolism. That would be the work that I would like to do in this, and I think it would be really interesting work to do.
I would love to see you at the helm, and that'd be really great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to link the episode you guys did, episode 541, on lean mass hyperresponders as a follow-up to this episode. I suspect you guys, I've listened to it before, but I suspect it went a little bit more in depth into some of these things. But I really appreciate you highlighting a lot of these concerns. It's not that I'm like I'm losing sleep over it, but I'm a smidge embarrassed at the amount of credit I had given them off the bat because of where I came to find myself introduced to the information. And so it's been good. Well, good is a strong word, but it's been good to take a step back and really see a lot of it for what it is, and which is, potentially interesting if done in the right way, but maybe not happening right now. So what else would you think people can find you if people want to get a little bit more of your work, if people want to sign up to the newsletter, if people want to, subscribe to your membership site?
Yeah, so the site is alineanutrition.com. That's a research review platform, nutrition research review platform. So our flagship content is a weekly deep dive, which is exactly that, a deep dive into a recently published study. Goes out every Friday. There's bi-monthly research lectures, which are kind of like video-based PowerPoint style presentations on a particular topic. And then that's the membership site. And then there's also the kind of free newsletter, which if people get to the site, they can just subscribe to as well, which goes out on Monday afternoons. And then, you can also find me with Danny Lennon on the Sigma Nutrition Radio podcast as well. So they're the main outlets.
Cool. Alan, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate you having you on.
Cheers, Jordan. Really good.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Where Optimal Meets Practical. If you liked the episode, it would mean the world to me if you posted a screenshot to your social media or left a 5-star review on iTunes. That stuff really helps. If you ever want to get in touch with me, just shoot me a DM on Instagram @JordanLipsFitness. I'm always around to chat. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.